Thank you, Beck. My co-authors in this work are Paul Hansen, who's a surfing economist who runs a company called 1000 Mines, and also Franz Omler, formerly of the New Zealand Treasury. So 1000 Mines is a New Zealand company that does MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. So I realize at this juncture in the conference, that's a bit of a mouthful, but you're all actually quite good at doing MCDA yourselves. So here's a couple of examples. It's maybe not as complex as where we have to go to when it comes to looking at negative emission technologies, but let me just walk you through these two examples. Let's start on the left. So here's something you can all do, but there's sort of 6 issues here you have to look at. There's competition, otherwise known as the field, how many horses are riding and what sort of quality are there. There's performance, how well your horse is going at the time. The environmental issues, so is the going soft or the going firm. The external assessment, so when the bookies come in and actually put the price. Unknowns, a little bit of rigging, a little bit of lead in the saddlebag, and always those surprises where the favourite falls at the final fence, or the 100-to-1 outsider you've put your $10 on wins. Similarly, when we move to something like house and contents policy, a whole range of issues there that you automatically weigh up in your mind. You're going to go with the big deductible, or you're going to skate by the sort of, landscape by the seat of your pants, or are you going to be more conservative? You're going to go fully comprehensive, or are you going to, again, go with the seat of your pants and go to third-party fire and theft? And again, we see these trade-offs between cost and safety and risk. And we also see, as we saw in the Banking Royal Inquiry, that there are unknowns. Read the small print, I think, is the watchword there. And it's not really any different when it comes to negative emission technologies. With one exception, we start to get a bit more bamboozled. We might be able to carry 6 or 7 permutations around placing a bet or organizing some house or car insurance. But when we're faced with a whole raft of different choices here and a whole bunch of issues, the whole thing really does start to thicken up very quickly. So how do we try and put these onto a more level sort of playing field to actually negotiate our way through that? And that's where 1000 Mines have come in. These are just a couple of stock slides that they use with quotes from dudes like Pythagoras or Boney or Albert Camus. But again, just making good decisions is important. And it's used a great deal. So 1000 Mines have done everything from the sort of sublime to the ridiculous, working with the World Health Organization recently to look at microbes and superbugs and what the priorities are there. In other cases, I hope it's an apocryphal story, but they seemingly arranged complex decision-making software for one of their friends to choose his partner, which apparently he tried to thank them for at the wedding speech. Which didn't go down well. But again, you can see from the list that's here, they're used widely through defense, environment, and in governmental sort of decision-making. And they have some other names such as conjoint analysis. And the reason they're used is because we're not as good at making decisions, particularly when things start to thicken up. When you're faced with, say, a matrix of 10 by 10, it gets fairly challenging to carry all of that in your head. And so, we're probably more on the right-hand side there with Bart as opposed to with Spock on the left-hand side in terms of making the calls. And again, having worked with 1000 Mines, there's a very broad literature that I won't go into today in detail for lots of mistakes where, we sort of shoot from the hip because we think we understand the parameter space and what's going on about it. So what we've done with 1000 Mines is we've actually starting to work on a script. It's not quite finished yet, but I'll sort of step you through it. I've come up with a series of sort of screen grabs from the website that I've been working on. And so what we've essentially done is tried to come up with some stuff. So here's a summary statement here. I think it's from Sabine Fuss's paper, but we've just taken that there and said, it's likely we're going to have a mixed sort of portfolio to meet, perhaps 1.5 degrees of warming. And so what I've done here is I've just grabbed 7 technologies that we've talked about here today. So BECS, DACS, biochar, some of the other ones that are a bit more out there like enhanced weathering or ocean fertilization where there are many more uncertainties. So we have 7 of those. And let's look at some characteristics then to differentiate between the technologies. There's 8 of those, so that immediately gives us a matrix of 7 by 8, so 56 possibilities. So again, the ability, I think, of probably anyone in the room to just carry that in their heads and actually step through the issues is really what we're trying to do here. So here we have costs, potential, side effects, innovation, upscaling, the range of challenges, the issue of permanency that we heard a lot about yesterday, and then also looking at sort of even the cumulative potentials if we go for some sort of a mixed model. And so where do we glean this information from? Again, from the recent paper from Sabine Fuss. Here's a couple of examples here. We can see here's a range of different literature costs here on enhanced weathering. You can see the upwards trajectory that we've been seeing in many cases that Andreas was talking a bit about yesterday. Similarly for ocean alkalization and also for ocean fertilization, here a range of different costs and potentials. So in some cases, we actually have some probably state-of-the-art data sets to actually put into this analysis. And so here's sort of a summary here of some of the best estimates, for example, for global net potentials that have been gleaned from some of those, the special issue of ERL that we've put together. So as I say, those are some hard numbers we can pop in there. And again, this is just a screen grab. Probably if we focus on the left-hand side, the right-hand side's a bit small, but you can see in other cases, with things like side effects where we don't really know, we have to be semi-quantitative at best. Or for example, if we take innovation, not much new, some novelty, novel, highly innovative. But again, it gives us a way where we can start to dissect out the different sorts of characteristics that we're looking at. And again, we've done that here, scaling up challenges, permanency, and ability to obtain social license. So again, we sort of build this up, and this is again just a part of the screen grab. This actually gives you all of the 8 different criteria we had, but if we just take a few examples, we can see in this example here, we've used some of the information from the Fuss et al. Paper in this section. If we take something like side effects, you can see, you know, we have to make some value judgments or some guesses here, but you would imagine the side effects at not particularly large scale of forestation or reforestation would be, you would score that fairly high, 3 out of 4, because it's probably got fewer side effects. If we take something like direct air capture and storage, we're giving it 4, with very few side effects. And then we take something like ocean fertilization, it scores poorly because, as we know from the research literature, there are many side effects there. And we've done that, as I say, for the potential, removal, side effects, innovation, and scaling up. Where that takes us to then is, again, this is a screen grab. This is your 28% through this. You basically take a test where you sit down and you've got to work through a bunch of questions. So in this case here, you've got 3 options. You have to weigh up, in this case here, a potentially higher CO2 removal, but a less chance of actually obtaining social license. With another case here, less potential to remove CO2, but a higher ability to obtain social license. So you can choose either one, or you can say they're equal. The other thing that this package then does is it uses a form of Bayesian logic called paprika to essentially then join the dots across these questions. And so to give you another example, we're 57% through our test now in this case here. Here's one where we have some permanency in this case, a transient effect in this case. We have some potential for social license, but less potential in this case here. So again, you step through a whole series of questions, you take the test. We've run one of these previously at the Royal Society in New Zealand. The paprika software joins the dots and completes the analysis over the sort of, while you're having your lunch. And what you end up with is this landscape of loadings. And so in the top-hand corner of this gradation, here's an area where perhaps in 15 of the questions, there'll be very much agreement. And you can put that part of the discussion to one side. You don't even need to go there. However, as you move down this gradient in terms of the loadings or the weightings that people give things, you end up where perhaps half of the room here has one view, the other half has a very different view. And that's really allows you to sort of drill down into the sort of choke points in the discussion, which in many cases I think is probably the way to go rather than sitting through another sort of 15 PowerPoints. You're actually taking ownership of the process, because you take the test, people talking at lunchtime about number 17 was a real banger of a question, and so forth and so on. And so we haven't quite finished this here. That's why I just showed you some screen grabs. You'll hear more from Michael Elwood. We're planning a follow-up meeting in the first half of next year, and we hope that we'll be able to encourage some of you to take this test. It can be taken on a laptop. It can be done remotely by the web. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boyd. And I'm not going to ask for any questions. That's the plan, isn't it?
Yes. Yep.
And instead, I'm going to hand over to Professor Boyd to make some more remarks for the last few minutes.
Apologies. I decided at some point yesterday, and I'd run it through some of the conference organisers, that obviously in these events, there's a certain fatigue factor starts to set in. And so what we've done is tried to put together just a couple of slides to try and crystallise out maybe some of the key points that you could maybe have a think about over lunch. And so I've just got 3 slides here to show you. So the first one is one that we saw many times yesterday from the recent UK group as paper in Science. And again, we had a lot of discussion around this here about this whole idea of a pull and push. On the one hand, we have to, through our NDCs, we have to somehow have emissions reduction, but then we also have to, in tandem then, come up with these realised negative emissions. And as we saw from Jessica's talk, there are many nuances and subtleties about the balance or the rate of some of those processes where this line sits. So what I've tried to do is put this actually into an Australian context. So all of the red text relates to Australia. So essentially for our NDCs, we can replace that with the ERF, the Emissions Reductions Fund that we heard from Paul Ryan about yesterday morning. If we look on the bottom axis here from 2015 onwards with this arrow, that's really the timeline that we have to scope and develop these negative CO2 emissions. And we also then are suggesting that we probably need to have some links to SDGs. It's something Andrew Lenton was talking about yesterday, and amongst others. And then we also heard, for example, from Michael Jeffries and other people about the need for environmental co-benefits to also factor that into that space. So where does that leave us then? Well, we seem to have a little bit of an asymmetry in a post-COP21 world in Australia. We have the Emissions Reduction Fund for different targets that we heard from Paul yesterday, comes in at a little bit over $2 billion. At present, with respect to carbon dioxide removal, and with the exception of the scoping report we heard about this morning for blue carbon, there's not really any money in that kitty at the minute, but yet over this sort of fairly short time scale, we have to sift and select through the different approaches. We have to test and develop them. We have to potentially link them to add value with other environmental issues like SDGs or in the case maybe something like soil carbon. And again, there are many uncertainties that we again heard in the previous keynote. We have to deploy, and we have to deploy at scale with some of the potential non-linearities that may bring either financially or with the benefits to the system. So those are just a few thoughts to maybe leave you with about where we go towards the end of the meeting and what are the sort of key points to come out of it. So as I say, thank you for indulging me, and I'll leave it there. Cheers.
Sure. We can probably fit in one question if somebody would like to.
Thank you. I really appreciated that first presentation. I think it's really useful to identify those rub points so that we can have a more productive public discourse. I think that's really great. I just wanted to offer that another part of the public discourse, and I feel like I've heard it in this room, that maybe we need to move away from. I feel like I'm hearing this theme of choosing either this or this solution or that solution. And I think given the scale of the problem that everyone keeps reiterating in all of the talks, that maybe we want to move away from that idea of choosing. Definitely we need to identify all the risks and benefits and the costs and the benefits, but I think we need to just throw everything we have at the problem and not choose either or, but just have multiple solutions all at once. That's my piece.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think the other nuance in that we haven't gone to is when we place climate changes in the frameworks of planetary boundaries. You know, it's pretty clear that we've heard from speakers yesterday that, you know, if you require too much land And a shift in land use, suddenly you butt into the whole issues of food security. It may be by having a mixed portfolio, you can actually offset some of those issues. So for example, in the ocean, if you do, for example, do sort of almost like marine spatial planning on an Australian scale, you might say, well, we're going to take this part of the coast and we're going to do ocean alkalization, as Andreas talked. But that may then compromise food security from a particular fishery. So you may then have to use something like IMTA, Integrated Marine Trophic Agriculture, to actually bolster food security in another part of the coast. So it's almost like this sort of patchwork quilt you may need to use in the end to not just sequester the carbon, but then also, as I say, deal out some compromises for some of the other services that you're actually influencing. Yeah, and again, maybe that's somewhere we can get to it at the next meeting next year is maybe start to look around Australia that there may be some regions that are best suited for one approach, but not another one. Because again, as we heard in Jessica's talk this morning, you do have this interplay and this competition between different approaches, for example, for land. And so maybe mapping that out might be another useful sort of way to differentiate them and as you say, not just to say, well, my one's best and you can go to hell sort of thing. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm still stuck on the cost question. I just have this fear as a messaging kind of person that the message that goes up to bureaucrats and politicians is, hey, it's way cheaper to delay. We heard yesterday that the costs, modelling doesn't really include all the feedbacks. And I can't imagine that it includes loss of human life. Well, I mean, it's always hard to know how to cost that. But if we're looking at the risk of, millions or possibly billions of people dying in the breakdown of human civilization because of, Will Stephen and crew saying that we could pass tipping points for hothouse Earth before 1.5 or 2, I just can't imagine they're factored in. And I'm wondering whether we shouldn't be more careful in terms of conveying that message.
It's given that we are the, what was it that Judith Sloan called us the other day, the henny penny scientists, we have to be a little bit careful about how we sort of push things out there in terms of the sky falling in around us. I think that's very difficult because I think when it comes to climate change, using too heavy-handed a message, even though that may be what could be on down the track, it doesn't really seem to gain you very much traction. I think people just hit the off button. And so I think probably a case of sort of gradualism is really the only way forward. I mean, certainly what we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks since Wentworth is, and it may be also linked into the 1.5 degree report from IPCC, is, a lot more constituencies are sort of hinting that climate change is going to be potentially a key driver in the next election. So maybe just running with that and running with a little bit of gradualism as opposed to, really pushing something else out there, might be the best way to actually get some traction. Because I think otherwise there is a danger where, it was the same in the ocean where we were talking about global warming, then we had ocean acidification. And when you start telling policy people about that, but wait, there's more bad news, it usually starts to fall on increasingly deaf ears because I think just down to our human nature, we're not very good at loading up with more and more bad news. We have to leaven the message somehow.
Okay, thank you. Justin wants to make one comment and he promised it will be very quick and then we'll break for lunch.
I just thought in response to Phil's earlier talk about the multi-decision, we want to make sure that the oil and gas industry, even though they're the industry and the mining industry, the industries we've loved to hate, they're in the room so they can answer those questions and try to get across the sort of tangled knots of decisions. So,
well, to respond to that very briefly, the nice thing, as I mentioned, is you can do this remotely. So you could actually go to different focus groups. You could find out what the journals on the Australian thought versus the Morning Herald versus oil and gas versus mining versus nice policymakers versus, the ANU. And, so we can do that because it is anonymous. And so you then come up with those landscapes of different loadings, and you can look at how much they are congruent or sort of incongruent. So we could probably tee that up.
Okay, thank you. So we'll break for lunch now and we'll come back at 1:30 for the next session. Please join me in thanking our two speakers and all of our questioners and everyone for joining in. Thank you.